Get your filthy black hands off that broom before I break it over your head, boy!
Dale Pruitt's venomous roar shattered the silence of the vehicle bay. Before Elias could even answer, Pruitt launched a brutal kick directly at the base of the industrial broom. The violent mechanical force ripped the handle straight out of Elias's grip, sending a sharp shockwave through his arms. Pruitt wasn't done. He stepped forward with a sudden, aggressive burst of motion, using his towering posture to invade Elias's space and forcefully shoving his shoulder back against a heavy metal parts shelf. Tools and iron chains rattled violently above them. With a savage grin, Pruitt then kicked a nearby metal oil bucket, slamming the heavy canister onto the ground and sending a dark, chaotic wave of industrial waste splashing right across Elias's worn work boots.
Look at you! You're a biological insult to my depot. You have exactly 10 minutes to scrub this floor with your bare hands, or you can take your sorry black attitude back to the gutters where you belong.
Elias stood perfectly still against the shaking shelf. He quietly looked down at his ruined boots, then raised his eyes to meet Pruitt's gaze. There was no fear, only the freezing, dangerous precision of a man taking a legal deposition. He had no idea that in 19 days, this same black man would be looking down at him from a federal bench, stripping him of his freedom forever. Before we witnessed that breathtaking moment of absolute justice, the exact second Dale Pruitt would give his entire life to take back. Let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments. And subscribe so you never miss the moment the powerful finally face the people they thought they could crush. But to understand how a man can be kicked and shoved and spat on without flinching, you have to understand who was actually standing in that vehicle bay. And to understand that, I have to take you back. Just a few months earlier, same county, a completely different world. If you've ever driven through the Tennessee River Valley on a fall morning, you know the kind of place Calhoun County is. 2-lane roads, kudzu swallowing old fences, a courthouse square with a Confederate monument the county keeps arguing about and never moves. There's money out near the lake. Buat, docks, second homes, men in quarter-zip pullovers who've never once worried about a light bill, and then there's the rest of it. Drive past the lake, past the last subdivision with a gate, turn off the state highway onto Depot Road, and you'll find a place most people in the county couldn't locate on a map, even though their tap water, their road salt, and their garbage trucks all come out of it. The Calhoun County Public Works Depot. 40 acres of gravel and corrugated steel, a fleet of orange dump trucks and salt spreaders, a fueling station, a parts warehouse, and a vehicle maintenance bay big enough to swallow a school gym. This is where the county's invisible machinery lives. The people who fill the potholes, clear the storm drains, plow the ice, and haul away everything the nice neighborhoods set out at the curb. And every dawn for 9 months, a new temporary maintenance hand had been clocking in here, under the name Eli Reeves, 57 years old. Gray coverall, a thermos of black coffee, a wide broom and a key to the supply closet. He swept the bays. He emptied the bins. He degreased the floor drains. He restacked the parts shelves the mechanics left in chaos. He worked 5, sometimes 6 hours before the other crews even arrived. And he did it without a single complaint. The men liked him. The ones at the bottom. Anyway, he was quiet. He listened. He remembered their kids' names. When young Marcus Tillman's transmission died and he couldn't get to work, it was Eli who quietly slipped him $40 for a bus pass and waved off the thank you. When old Roy Delgado's back gave out lifting a battery, it was Eli who finished his row of trucks so Roy wouldn't get written up. Nobody on Depot Road knew who Eli Reeves really was, because Eli Reeves wasn't really a janitor. His real name was Elias Boone. He was born in 1969 in a railroad town in Alabama, in the back bedroom of a house his grandmother owned outright. A fact she repeated like scripture. Because in that town, in that decade, a black family owning anything outright was a small act of defiance. His father, Cornelius Boone, was a Pullman porter. For 40 years, Cornelius made up berths, shined shoes, carried bags, and answered to the name George, because that's what every white passenger called every porter, regardless of his real name. After George Pullman himself, 40 years of being timed, 40 years of a conductor with a stopwatch standing over him, clocking how fast he could turn a sleeping car, docking his pay if he was 30 seconds slow, never once asking his name. Cornelius came home every night with his feet swollen and his dignity folded up small enough to fit in his shirt pocket. And every night he took it back out and set it on the kitchen table where his son could see it. He kept that conductor's stopwatch, won it in a card game off a retiring conductor in 1971. Brass case, worn smooth. He'd set it on the table and say, "They can time your hands. So, they can time every step you take in this life, but they cannot time your worth. That clock right there only measures what a man with a stopwatch is afraid of." Elias didn't understand it as a boy. He understood it later. He understood it for the rest of his life. By the time Elias was 10, he was the kind of child teachers either championed or resented. Too sharp, too watchful, asking questions that exposed the answer the adult didn't have. He read the entire civil rights shelf of the town library, then read it again. He watched his father be called boy by a man half his age at the hardware store. Watched a grown man twice. That boy's worth swallow it in silence. And he decided, at 10 years old, on the gravel outside that hardware store, what he was going to do with his one life. He was going to learn the law so well that no man with a clipboard or a stopwatch or a badge would ever again be able to time his worth, or his father's, or anyone's who looked like them. He earned a scholarship to a state university, the first in his family, then law school, on loans that took him 15 years to pay. He joined the Army as a JAG officer because the Army would pay, and because his father had always said a uniform was the one suit of clothes a white man in that county had to salute. For 30 years, Elias Boone built a record. 8 years in uniform as a military lawyer, prosecuting and defending, learning that the law was only ever as good as the person willing to apply it without fear. Then 2 decades as a civil rights litigator, the kind who sued cities, counties, sheriff's departments, and state agencies on behalf of the people those institutions had decided not to see. He sued a county that had been quietly purging its black poll workers. He won. He sued a sheriff's department that ran a private watch list of local black men. He won. He sued a public utility that charged its poorest, blackest neighborhoods the highest rates and shut off their water first. He won that one twice, because they appealed. And he won the appeal. He buried his wife, Adair, after 31 years of marriage. A school principal who'd spent her career making sure the poorest kids in the county got the same shot as the richest. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless. She'd told him, near the end, in the gray light of a hospital room, "Don't you dare go quiet. Elias, you don't get to grieve me by getting small. You go be the thing this county never had. You go be the one who's already inside the room when they finally look up." He'd promised her. He kept it. 18 months after Adair passed, the president nominated Elias Boone to a federal judgeship, United States District Judge, for the district that includes Calhoun County. the same valley, the same courthouse square with the monument they never move. The Senate confirmed him on a Thursday in February. His robing ceremony, the formal investiture, the public swearing in, was scheduled for the spring, and in the 9 months between his confirmation and his investiture, Elias Boone did something his clerks, his colleagues, and the legal press would never fully understand. He took a temporary maintenance job at the Calhoun County Public Works Depot under his mother's maiden name. People who heard the story afterward assumed it was a stunt, a judge slumming, a man playing poor for a good anecdote. It was the opposite of that. For 30 years, Elias Boone had sued institutions from the outside. He'd deposed superintendents and chiefs and directors across mahogany tables. He'd read their policies, subpoenaed their emails, cross-examined their excuses. And in all those years, he'd learned one thing that gnawed at him. You can never fully see how an institution treats the people at the bottom of it from the witness stand. By the time a case reaches a courtroom, everyone is performing. The cruelty has been cleaned up, lawyered, and renamed. He wanted to feel it. Once, before he spent the rest of his career judging these cases from 11 feet up, he wanted to stand inside the machine, at the very bottom of it, wearing the uniform of the most disposable man in the building, and find out what a public institution does to a person when it is absolutely certain no one important is watching. He chose public works because it was the cleanest test. A county agency, public money, public trust, 40 men, most of them black or Latino, most of them seasonal, most of them one missed shift away from nothing. If a county would treat these men with dignity when no judge was in the room, then maybe the system worked. And if it wouldn't, then he wanted to know exactly how it failed, in his own body, before he ever ruled on it. So he kept his father's stopwatch in his coverall pocket, and he clocked in. He found out fast. And what he found was worse than anything he had argued in 30 years of courtrooms, because this time it wasn't a transcript. It was happening to him. Now let me tell you about the man who kicked a broom out of a federal judge's hands. Dal Pruitt, 49 years old, operations superintendent of the Calhoun County Public Works Depot for 11 years, a county employee his entire adult life, which meant he had learned, with the patience of a man tending a garden, exactly how much cruelty a public institution will tolerate from a mid-level supervisor, as long as the trucks run on time and the paperwork looks clean. Pruitt ran the depot like a private kingdom. He had a corner office with a window onto the bay, a county truck he used for personal errands, and a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Boss" that he thought was funnier than anyone else did. He was a big man, and he used his size the way a bully always does. Leaning in, blocking doorways, standing too close, so a smaller man had to crane his neck to answer. And he had a system. It started small, the way these things do. Pruitt controlled the overtime. In a place where men lived shift to shift, overtime wasn't extra. It was the difference between making rent and not, and Pruitt handed it out like a feudal lord, handing out grain. The men who laughed at his jokes got the Saturday salt runs. The men who flattered him got the storm emergency callouts at time and a half. The men who didn't, the quiet ones, the proud ones, the ones who looked him in the eye a half second too long, got nothing. Their hours dried up. Their families felt it. And they learned. Then there was the list. Pruitt kept a private spreadsheet on his county computer. He called it, to the 2 supervisors he trusted, his attitude file. It was a running log of every man who'd ever, in Pruitt's judgment, copped an attitude, talked back, filed a complaint, asked why his hours were cut, asked for the safety gear, the county was legally required to provide. Next to each name was a column of dates, and a column of petty infractions Pruitt collected like a magpie. Clocked in 2 minutes late. Took a long lunch. Left work area without authorization. He wasn't collecting these for the county. The county didn't know the file existed. He was collecting them so that when he wanted a man gone, a man who'd embarrassed him, or stood up to him, or simply been black and unafraid in a way Pruitt couldn't stand, he'd have a folder thick enough to make the firing look like documentation instead of what it really was. And then there was the grievance box. The county had a policy. Workers who felt they'd been treated unfairly could file a written grievance, drop it in a locked box in the break room, and it would be forwarded to County Human Resources downtown for review. It was the one thread of due process the men had. The one channel that went over Pruitt's head. Pruitt had a key to that box. He emptied it himself. Every Friday. And the grievances. The ones about cut hours, missing safety gear, racial slurs on the yard, the ones with the men's careful handwriting and their fear pressed into every line. Those grievances never made it downtown. They went into the shredder behind his desk. For 11 years, Calhoun County HR had received exactly 4 grievances from a depot of 40 men. Pruitt had shredded over 200. This was the machine Elias Boone walked into with a broom. Let me show you how the machine actually ran. Day to day. Because the cruelty of a place like this is rarely a single dramatic blow. It is 1,000 small adjustments, each one deniable, each one defensible, each one leaving no fingerprints. And that is precisely what makes it so hard to fight from the witness stand. And precisely why Elias Boone needed to feel it from the inside. Take the morning meeting. Every day at 6. Pruitt gathered the crews in the bay for the haul assignments. He'd stand on the bottom step of the loading dock with his clipboard, so he was a head taller than everyone. And he'd read out the routes. And the men learned to read the meeting the way sailors read weather. If you were in favor, you got the lake routes. Bavette. Short. Easy. Home by 2. If you'd fallen out of favor, you got the back county gravel runs. The ones that beat a truck and a spine to pieces. The ones that ran long so you missed dinner. Pruitt never said, "I'm punishing you." He just read names off a clipboard. And the punishment was in the geography. Take the safety gear. The county budgeted for it. Gloves. Back braces. Steel-toed boots. Respirators for the men who worked the salt and the solvents. Pruitt controlled the requisitions. New gear became a reward. Like the overtime, a man who flattered him got a fresh pair of boots. A man who'd asked one too many questions got told the budget was tight. Wear what you've got. And signed a form. Pruitt always made them sign a form, acknowledging the gear was temporarily unavailable. Those signed forms went into the attitude file too. Recast as proof the man was a complainer. Take the way Pruitt talked. He was careful. In the way that men who've never been held accountable become connoisseurs of careful. He almost never said a slur outright where it could be quoted clean by someone who mattered. He worked in implication. He'd gent full white driving from the Torquay. He'd tell a white driver to count his tools within earshot of a black mechanic. He'd refer to the seasonal crews. Almost all of them black or Latino. As you people. And then, if anyone stiffened, add you seasonal people with a little smile. So the insult had a trap door. He'd call a 57-year-old man-boy and, if challenged, say he calls everybody boy. It's just an expression. He had built, over 11 years, an entire grammar of cruelty engineered to be felt but never transcribed. The open venom, the kicked buckets, the hands on a man's shoulder. Those he saved for the men he was certain were nobody. The ones with no power and no witnesses who counted, and it worked. That was the thing that sat heaviest on Elias Boone. It worked. The men felt every bit of it. The geography of the routes, the rationed boots, the trapdoor insults, the shoves and the spit, when no one important was looking. And they had almost no way to prove any single piece of it. Each individual act, lifted out and held up alone, could be explained. The routes rotate. The budget was tight. It's just an expression. The cruelty lived in the pattern, and you cannot subpoena a pattern unless someone has been patient enough to write the whole thing down. That, Elias Boone decided, would be his job. Not to catch Pruitt in one quotable moment, to write down the whole pattern, dated and corroborated, until the trapdoors had nowhere left to drop, and for 9 months, Judge Boone, Eli Reeves, swept the floor of it, and watched, and remembered, and absorbed blow after blow, and said nothing, because he wasn't there to save one man. He was there to understand the whole machine, well enough to take it apart. He saw it all from the bottom, where the view is clearest. He saw young Marcus Tillman, 23, with a baby at home. He get his hours cut to nothing the week after he asked Pruitt, politely, hat in his hands, why the white seasonal hire who started a month after him was already getting Saturday overtime. He saw Marcus go home to a wife who was counting on those hours. Saw Roy Delgado, 61, 3 years from a pension he'd been promised. Get written up for insubordination because he'd asked for a back brace the county was supposed to supply. He saw the write-up go straight into Pruitt's attitude file. He watched Pruitt grab a black mechanic named Curtis by the back of the collar and march him out of the bay for a clogged drain that wasn't even Curtis's job. Loud enough for everyone to hear. And tell a white driver in the same breath that he'd better count his tools. He watched Curtis's hands go still. Watched him decide, in real time, that there was no version of responding that didn't end with him fired and broke. And watched him swallow it, the way Elias had watched his own father swallow it outside a hardware store 45 years before. He watched a young Latino hire named Hector get assigned the salt spreader 3 weeks running with no respirator, because the respirators were on order, and watched Hector come off shift coughing blood specks into a paper towel, and watched Pruitt sign another form, and he felt it on his own body. Again and again. The shove into a shelf, the bucket kicked across his boots, the broom kicked out of his hands, the word boy thrown at a 57-year-old man like a rock. Pruitt singled out the quiet old janitor more than anyone, because the quiet old janitor never fought back. And a bully feeds on the ones who don't. What Pruitt could not see, what no one in that bay could see, was that every single time the broom hit the floor, a federal judge was filing it away. Time, date, witnesses, words, the precise, freezing patience of a man who had spent 30 years turning cruelty into evidence, and he watched the men file grievances. He watched Marcus write one out at the break room table, his tongue between his teeth, spelling carefully, and drop it in the locked box with something like hope on his face. And he watched, 2 days later, from the supply closet, through the gap in the door, as Dale Pruitt unlocked that box, carried a fistful of envelopes into his office, and fed them one by one into the shredder while he ate a sandwich. He watched a man's hope get eaten with a sandwich. Elias Boone stood in that supply closet with his father's stopwatch in his pocket, and his hand wrapped around it so hard the brass left a mark in his palm. He did not say anything. Not yet, but that night, in the small rented house where he was living out his 9 months, he opened a legal pad and began to do the one thing he had spent 30 years learning to do better than almost anyone alive. He began to build a record. Here is what most people never understand about a man like Elias Boone. The cruelty didn't make him want to shout. It made him want to be exact. He knew that anger, on its own, changes nothing. He'd watched 100 righteous, furious people lose to institutions because fury isn't admissible and a feeling can't be subpoenaed. What beats an institution is a record. Clean, dated, corroborated, and impossible to wave away. So, for his weeks at the depot, the janitor with the broom became something else after hours. He kept a contemporaneous log. Every incident. Dated. Timed. His father's stopwatch was good for that. Described in flat, factual language. Who said what? Who was present? What happened to whose hours afterward? The day his shoulder hit the shelf, he wrote down the time, the words, the names of the 3 supervisors who laughed, the day the bucket splashed across his boots. He photographed the boots when he got home. There were nights he sat at the kitchen table of his small rented house until past midnight, the legal pad in front of him, the stopwatch beside it, writing in the small, precise hand he'd developed over 30 years of taking depositions. And on those nights, more than once, he found himself thinking about his father. He thought about the way Cornelius used to come home, ease himself into a kitchen chair, and take off his shoes like they were made of iron. He thought about the stopwatch, how a conductor had stood over his father with that exact brass case, clicking it, timing how fast a black man could turn a sleeping car, docking his pay over seconds. For 40 years they timed his father's hands. They measured him in fractions of a minute, as if a man's whole worth could be read off a dial, and here was Elias, half a century later, using the same stopwatch for the opposite purpose, not to time a man's hands, but to time a man's cruelty, to put a clock on Dale Pruitt, to date and measure and pin down every kick and every slur, so that the dial finally pointed the other way. He thought his father would have liked that. He thought his father, who died believing the law only ever happened to men like them, might have sat up a little in his kitchen chair to see his son turn the timing instrument into a weapon for the people at the bottom. They can time your hands, but they cannot time your worth. He could hear it. He wrote until the words ran out, and then he set down the pen and closed the stopwatch in his hand and sat in the dark kitchen for a while. An old grief and a new resolve sitting side by side. And then he got up and went to bed. Because he had to clock in at 5. He didn't have to snoop. That was the thing. He worked the closing shift. He had a key to the supply room that shared a wall with Pruitt's office. And Dale Pruitt, like all men who have never once been held accountable, was loud. He bragged. He left his computer unlocked. He talked to his 2 favored supervisors, with his door open because it had never in 11 years occurred to him that the janitor was a person who could hear. Elias never touched Pruitt's computer. He was far too careful, too aware of how evidence has to be obtained to survive a courtroom. But he didn't need to. He simply documented what any employee in that building could lawfully see and hear and feel. The public berating on the bay floor, the assaults anyone could witness, the overtime favoritism anyone could chart, the grievance box being emptied by the one man who wasn't supposed to have a key, and he did something else. He talked to the men, quietly, off the yard, at the taco truck on the highway, over coffee, on the tailgate of Roy Delgado's truck. After shift, he never told them who he was. He just asked questions. The way a man asks when he's actually listening. When did your hours get cut? Did you file anything? Did you ever hear back? Do you still have your copy? There was an evening in late winter he'd remember. 4 of them on the tailgate of Roy's truck in the gravel lot. The sky going the color of a bruise. A thermos going around. Roy was talking about the pension. 3 years out. And how Pruitt knew it. And how a man who's close to a pension is a man you can squeeze. Because he can't afford to quit, and he can't afford a write-up that sticks. Hector was rubbing the cough out of his chest. Marcus was quiet. The way he got when he was doing math in his head about rent. And Eli, the old janitor, the one they'd let into their circle, because he was kind, and he listened, and he never repeated anything. Eli asked the question that changed everything. When you dropped your grievance in that box, he said to Marcus. Did you keep a copy? Marcus shrugged. My wife made me take a picture of it. On my phone, before I put it in. He said it almost embarrassed. Like it was paranoid. She don't trust that box. Eli was quiet for a second. Your wife, he said, is the smartest person at this depot. And something in how he said it made all 4 men look at him. Because it wasn't the way a janitor talks. It was the way a man talks who has just heard a piece of evidence land. Roy laughed. Listen to all Eli. What are you? A lawyer. Eli smiled and passed the thermos. I just pay attention, he said. And here is the detail that would matter more than anything. Some of the men had kept their copies. Marcus Tillman had photographed his grievance on his phone before he dropped it in the box. Not because he was clever, but because his wife had told him to keep a record of everything. Because his wife was the smartest person in their household, and she didn't trust that box for a second. Roy Delgado had a shoebox at home, with 3 years of write-ups and a carbon copy of every safety request the county had ignored. Hector had screenshots of the texts where he'd asked 4 times about the respirator. The men had been building their own record all along. They just had no one with the power to read it. Now they had a janitor who, it would turn out, had spent 30 years learning to read exactly this. 3 weeks before the investiture, it nearly came apart. Marcus Tillman got fired. It happened on a Tuesday. Pruitt called Marcus into his office at the end of shift, with one of his favored supervisors there as a witness, and laid the attitude file on the desk. 8 pages. Every 2 minutes late. Every long lunch. Every left work area. Going back 14 months. He told Marcus the county had no choice. Pattern of misconduct. Unreliable. He even managed to sound regretful about it. The way a man sounds regretful when he's enjoying himself. Marcus came out of that office gray-faced. 23 years old. A baby at home. And now nothing. He sat down on an overturned bucket by the fuel pumps and put his head in his hands. And the other men gave him the wide. Helpless birthmen give a drowning person. They don't know how to reach. Eli Reeves walked over. Sat down on the concrete next to him. Didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, quietly, you photographed your grievance. The one about the overtime. You still have it. Marcus looked up. Confused. Yeah. On my phone. Why does that matter now? Don't delete. Eli said. Don't delete anything. The text where you asked about your hours. The photo of the grievance. The names of everybody who was in that office today. Write down the time it happened tonight. While you remember it. He paused. Can you trust me 3 more weeks? Marcus stared at him. This quiet old man with a broom who emptied the trash. Who'd given him bus fare. Who he'd never once thought of as anything but kind and small. And there was something in Eli's face right then that Marcus would try to describe to his wife that night and fail. He didn't look like a janitor. He looked like a man who already knew how the whole thing ends. 3 weeks. Marcus said. Yeah. Okay. That night, Elias Boone sat at his kitchen table for a long time with his father's stopwatch in his hand, because here was the temptation. He could end it now. He could pick up the phone, identify himself. This is Judge-Designate Elias Boone, and I want you to know what's happening at the Public Works Depot, and detonate Dale Pruitt's entire kingdom with a single call. The county would fall over itself. Pruitt would be gone by Friday. Marcus would have his job back by Monday, and Elias would get to feel, for one clean righteous minute, like he'd done something. He turned the stopwatch over in his hand and made himself think it all the way through, the way he'd made himself think every case all the way through for 30 years. Past the satisfying part, into the part that actually mattered, because if he did it that way, a phone call, a judge's word against a superintendent's, no record, no due process. What happened next? Pruitt would lawyer up. He'd produce the attitude file, 8 pages on Marcus, 3 years of write-ups on Roy, a stack of signed forms acknowledging the boots that never came. He'd say every firing was documented. Every route rotation was routine. The grievance box jammed sometimes. He'd say a powerful man with a personal grudge, a judge, no less, was trying to destroy a hard-working public servant over a misunderstanding. And the worst part, the part that turned Elias's stomach, was that it might even work. Because Pruitt had spent 11 years manufacturing exactly the paper he'd need for this exact day. And even in the best case, even if the county panicked and fired Pruitt on the spot, what would actually change? They'd transfer him, maybe, or quietly let him go. And the machine would survive. The grievance box would still be a locked box with one man's key. The overtime would still be feudal grain. The next superintendent would inherit the key and the spreadsheet and the whole patient apparatus. And on Depot Road, nothing would be different. Roy would still be 3 years short. The boots would still be on order. A man's hope would still get eaten with a sandwich. Adair's voice came to him in the kitchen. You go be the one who's already inside the room when they finally look up, not the one who shouts from outside the room, not the one who makes a phone call and feels righteous, the one who is already inside, with a record, with the law, with a remedy that outlives the man. He wasn't going to settle for being right. Being right was cheap. Being right was a feeling. And he'd watched 100 righteous people lose. He was going to make it enforceable. He was going to build something Dale Pruitt's lawyer couldn't wave away and the next superintendent couldn't inherit around. A record so clean and a remedy so binding that the machine itself would have to change, with a federal court standing over it to make sure it stayed changed. That would take more than a phone call. It would take the record. It would take the right people. And it would take 3 more weeks of clocking in a gray coverall, and saying morning to a man he was quietly, patiently dismantling. He picked up the phone, but not to call the county. He called an old friend, a former colleague now at the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and a second old friend, an investigator he'd trusted for 20 years. And he made a request that would, in 19 days, put 6 unmarked federal vehicles on Depot Road. Then he went back to work. He clocked in the next morning at 5 a.m. in his gray coverall and swept the bay and said morning to Dale Pruitt and let the man believe he'd won. Which brings us back to that morning in the vehicle bay. The morning of the kicked broom and the splashed boots and the word boy thrown at a 57-year-old man. It was Dale Pruitt's last good day. Though he didn't know it, he'd been in a foul mood. A county commissioner had toured the depot the week before and asked, in passing, why turnover among the seasonal crews was so high. Pruitt had smiled and blamed the labor pool these days. But the question had rattled him. He needed to feel large again. And there's no easier way for a small man to feel large than to find the most disposable person in the room and make him smaller. He found the janitor. He kicked the broom out of his hands. He shoved him into the shelf until the chains rattled. He kicked the oil bucket across his boots. He told him to scrub the floor with his bare hands or crawl back to the gutters where he belonged. And 3 spineless supervisors laughed. "I'm just here to do the work." "Sir?" was all Elias said, and he bent down in his ruined boots and picked the broom up off the floor and kept sweeping, slow and even, the way his father used to make up a berth, perfectly, deliberately, refusing to be hurried by a man with a stopwatch. Roy Delgado watched from across the bay, and his jaw worked, and he had to look away, because he could not stand to watch a man as decent as Eli be treated like an animal. Marcus, who'd already been fired and was only there to clean out his locker, stood in the doorway with his box of belongings and felt a hatred so pure it scared him. What none of them knew, what Pruitt didn't know, was that the man holding the broom had died the night before, received final confirmation. The investiture was moving forward. The DOJ inquiry had opened a file, and in 19 days, he would be a sitting United States District Judge. Dale Pruitt had just assaulted a federal judge in front of a dozen witnesses and called him boy. The stopwatch in Elias Boone's pocket ticked on for 19 days. Nothing happened. From Dale Pruitt's side of the world. Anyway, Eli Reeves finished out the last week of his temporary contract and turned in his keys on a Friday. Pruitt didn't even look up when the janitor set the supply closet key on the counter. "Leave it there," he said. Not glancing from his computer, he had no idea he'd just been handed back the key by the most dangerous man who would ever stand in his office. "Thank you for the work," Elias said. Pruitt grunted. That was the last time Dale Pruitt would ever speak to Eli Reeves. The next time he saw that face, it would be looking down at him from a bench, 11 feet above him, and there would be nothing he could do. The investiture of a federal judge is a quiet kind of grand. It happened on a Tuesday morning in the ceremonial courtroom of the federal courthouse downtown, 40 minutes from Depot Road. A different planet entirely. Vaulted ceiling, flex, a gallery full of judges in robes, members of the bar, family, press. Elias Boone stood at the front in a black robe that still smelled of the box it came in. His daughter held the Bible, their family Bible, the one his grandmother had owned outright, and on the bench in front of him, in plain view of anyone close enough to see, he had set a single object, a brass stopwatch, worn smooth, 40 years old. He had thought, that morning, about everyone who wasn't in the room. His father, Cornelius, who'd been timed for 40 years and called by another man's name, and who died believing the law was a thing that happened to men like him. Never for them. His mother, who'd played organ and saved every dollar and never once let him believe the door was permanently closed. His grandmother and her paid-off house. And Adair most of all, who'd sat up in a hospital bed with the light going gray and told him, "You go be the one who's already inside the room when they finally look up." He'd have given the robe and the title and everything else just to have her in the third row. She wasn't, so he'd brought the stopwatch instead. The one thing that carried all of them. He took the judicial oath in a voice that did not waver, to administer justice without respect to persons, and to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. When he reached those words, equal right to the poor and to the rich, he picked up his father's stopwatch off the bench and closed it inside his fist. And the people who knew him saw the only crack in his composure of the entire morning, a tightening at the jaw, A breath held a half-second too long. A man holding 40 years of his father's swallowed dignity in one closed hand and refusing, by sheer will, to let it spill out of his eyes. Then he opened his hand, set the watch back down, and he was Judge Boone, United States District Judge for the district that includes Calhoun County. He stepped down, embraced his daughter, shook the hands of judges who'd waited years to call him a colleague. The local paper ran a photograph. First black federal judge seated in the district's history. The article ran his biography. Pullman Porter's son. Jag Chernal. 3 decades of civil rights litigation. The cases he'd won against counties and sheriffs and utilities. It did not mention that, until the previous Friday, the new judge had been pushing a broom across the floor of the Calhoun County Public Works Depot, getting it kicked out of his hands by a man who called him boy. That part was about to come out a different way. 11 days after the investiture, on a Thursday morning, 6 unmarked vehicles turned off the state highway onto Depot Road. They were not dramatic. That's what the men remembered most. No sirengs, no lights, just 6 clean dark sedans and SUVs. Government plates, rolling slowly down the gravel and parking in a neat row across the front of the maintenance bay. Doors opened. 12 people got out. Some in suits, some in windbreakers with 3 letters stenciled across the back. The same 3 letters that had once stood for the agency that protected the very rights Dale Pruitt had been quietly shredding in his office for 11 years. A woman in a charcoal suit walked to the front. Special Agent Dana Okafor. Lead investigator. Civil Rights Division. She held a folder and a list of names. Dale Pruitt came out of his office. He'd seen the cars from his window. He had his clipboard. He always had his clipboard. And the bravado of a man who has never once been on the wrong side of an institution. "Help you folks," he called out. In the loud, easy voice he used on commissioners. "This is a county facility. You need to check in at the front office." "Mr. Pruitt," Agent Okafor said. "Not a question. We have a few things to talk about." What happened over the next 2 hours? The men of the depot would tell and retell for the rest of their lives. The agents had a warrant. They imaged the county computers, including the one with the attitude file on it, the one Pruitt had been too arrogant to ever delete. They interviewed the workers. On B1. In the break room, with the door closed and a promise of protection. You have to understand what that promise meant to these men. For their entire working lives, telling the truth about a boss had been the fastest way to lose everything. The grievance box had taught them that the truth went into a shredder, and now, on the beone, they sat down across a folding table from a federal investigator who wrote down every word like it was load-bearing, who asked follow-up questions, who said thank you. That's important. Can you tell me the date? And something cracked open in that break room that had been sealed shut for 11 years. Roy Delgado brought his shoebox, set it on the table with both hands, the way you'd set down something fragile. 3 years of write-ups, carbon copies of safety requests, the signed forms acknowledging the boots that never came. The agent went through it page by page. And at one point she stopped and looked up at Roy and said, "You kept all of this." And Roy, 61 years old, said, "I figured somebody might want to see it someday. I just didn't think anybody ever would." And he had to look at the ceiling for a second. Hector showed his screenshots. Curtis described, in a low voice, the day Pruitt grabbed him by the collar, and the date, and who was standing there, and Marcus Tillman, fired 3 weeks before, who'd kept the photograph of his grievance because his wife told him to, sat down across from a federal investigator and told the truth, and watched her write it all down like it mattered. Like he mattered. For the first time in his working life, unbe1, the shoeboxes and the screenshots and the careful, frightened memories came out of hiding, and one by one, they went into a federal record that no shredder could touch. Dale Pruitt's bravado lasted about 20 minutes. It died the moment Agent Okafor asked him, in a flat voice, to explain why a locked grievance box that was supposed to be forwarded, unopened, to County HR, had a key on his personal keyring, and why HR had received 4 grievances in 11 years from a depot of 40 men. Pruitt's mouth opened, closed. "That box jams," he said. "I was just emptying it like always. We have the shredder," Okafor said, "and we have the box. And we have a great many men out there with photographs of grievances that were never delivered. So you might want to stop talking and call a lawyer." But here is the part of the story that turned Dale Pruitt's blood to ice water. Because the investigation was a federal civil rights matter. And because of how this particular district works, the case was assigned to a United States district judge for the initial proceedings. It was assigned to the newest judge on the bench. 3 weeks later, Dale Pruitt walked into a federal courtroom downtown for a preliminary hearing. Flanked by a lawyer, his union had found him. Certain he could explain it all away. Certain that no county paper pusher ever really goes down for the way things have always been done. He sat at the table. He straightened his tie. He looked up at the bench as the bailiff called the room to rise. He'd spent the drive downtown, rehearsing. His lawyer had told him the strategy. The firings were documented. The routes rotate. The budget was tight. The grievance box jams sometimes. And at the end of the day, this is how every public works department in the state has always run. Pruitt believed it. He'd believed it for 11 years. He believed that the way things had always been done was a kind of law unto itself, older and stronger than anything a court could say, and that men like him, men who kept the trucks running, were too useful to ever really be touched. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The United States District Court is now in session." And the judge walked in, black robe, gray at the temples, 57 years old. He moved to the bench with the unhurried, deliberate calm of a man making up a Pullman berth, refusing to be rushed. Dale Pruitt rose. Because everyone rises. For the first second, the judge was just a shape. A robe. En institution. The thing Pruitt had come downtown to outmaneuver. He even had the ghost of his commissioner's smile ready. The easy one. The one that said, "We're all reasonable men here." Then the judge reached the bench and turned, and the light fell on his face, and the easy smile died on Dale Pruitt's mouth. He knew that face. He knew it the way you know a face from a dream you can't quite place. And then the place arrived. All at once. Like ice water down the back of the neck. The bay. The fluorescent lights. The wide push broom kicked across the oil-stained concrete. The gray coverall 2 sizes too big. The thermos of black coffee. The quiet old man he had shoved into a shelf. The one he had splashed with a bucket of waste. The one he had called boy and biological insult. The one who emptied his trash and said morning every day, in a voice Pruitt had never once bothered to really hear. It was the janitor. It was Eli Reeves. The man he'd told to scrub the floor with his bare hands. The man he'd kicked the broom away from. The man he'd called boy in front of 40 men. The man he'd handed his keys back to without looking up. The man he had decided, with total and casual certainty, was no one, was nothing, was furniture with a pulse he could shove and spit on and discard. That man was now wearing a federal robe and looking down at him from 11 feet up. The blood left Dale Pruitt's face so fast he swayed and had to put a hand flat on the table to keep his feet. His lawyer glanced over, Elamil, and whispered something. "Are you all right?" But Pruitt couldn't answer, because his throat had closed, because his mind was doing something terrible and involuntary. It was replaying every morning meeting, every cruel route read off a clipboard, every form he'd made a man sign, every grievance he'd fed to the shredder with a sandwich in his other hand, every kick, every shove, every slur, all of it, in front of this man. This man had been standing in the supply closet. This man had been on the tailgate of Roy Delgado's truck. This man had felt the shoulder hit the shelf, had felt the oil splash across his boots, and had said, "I'm just here to do the work. Sir," and bent down and picked up his broom. Pruitt's mouth moved. Nothing came out. Judge Elias Boone sat down. He arranged his papers without hurry. He set one small object on the bench, in front of him, where the light caught it and threw a small, bright point across the dark wood. A worn brass stopwatch. He looked down at Dale Pruitt over the top of his glasses, and his face held no triumph, no anger, nothing a man could even accuse him of enjoying. He had waited 30 years and worn a janitor's coverall for 9 months and absorbed every blow that big man could throw and buried a wife who told him not to go small. And now that the moment had finally come, there was nothing on his face at all but the terrible, level calm of the law. Finally looking up, "Mr. Pruitt," Judge Boone said, in a voice Dale Pruitt knew, the same voice that had once said, "I'm just here to do the work. Sir, please, be seated." And Dale Pruitt sat down, because his legs would no longer hold him. Now, the law is not a revenge story, and Elias Boone had spent 30 years respecting that more than any man in the building. So let me tell you what actually happened in that courtroom, because the truth is more powerful than the fantasy. A judge cannot preside over a case in which he is, himself, a witness. Elias Boone knew this before he ever set foot on the bench. I knew it the way he knew his own name, the way he knew his father's stopwatch by the weight of it in his palm. There was never going to be a moment where he sentenced Dale Pruitt from the bench. That was never the plan, because that would not have been the law. And Elias Boone had spent 30 years believing that the law's power comes precisely from the fact that it binds the people who wield it. A judge who bends the rules to punish his enemy is just Dale Pruitt with a better office. So the hearing that morning was a preliminary matter. And Judge Boone did exactly what the law required and what his 30 years demanded. On the record, in open court, in a voice that carried to the back of the gallery, he disclosed it. "Let the record reflect," he said, in that granite-level voice, "that the court has a personal connection to the underlying facts of this matter. For a period of approximately 9 months ending this past spring, the undersigned was employed as a temporary maintenance worker at the Calhoun County Public Works Depot, under the name Eli Reeves. The court is therefore a percipient witness to certain events at issue and will be recusing from any further proceedings in this matter. The court is entering its observations into the record by sworn declaration and referring the matter for reassignment to another judge of this district." You could have heard a pin drop. The court reporter's hands paused over her keys. Pruitt's lawyer turned slowly to look at his client, and on his face was the expression of a man who has just realized the iceberg is much, much larger underwater. Dale Pruitt understood, in that moment, the full architecture of what had happened to him. The quiet janitor he'd assaulted hadn't ambushed him from the bench. He'd done something far worse, far more permanent, far more impossible to fight. He had been there. He had seen all of it, felt all of it. not heard about it, not read about it in a complaint, but stood in the room and lived it. For 9 months. With his own eyes and his own body. And now the man with the gavel. The most credible witness imaginable. A federal judge with 30 years of unimpeachable integrity and a Senate confirmation and a Pullman porter's stopwatch on the bench, was placing a sworn, dated, eyewitness account of Dale Pruitt's depot into the permanent record of a federal court. You cannot cross-examine that into nothing. You cannot put it in an attitude file. You cannot tell a jury that a federal judge, with no stake in the outcome, who happened to spend 9 months pushing a broom across your floor, is a disgruntled complainer with a grudge. You cannot empty it into a box behind your desk before he stepped down to let another judge take the case. Elias Boone did one more thing. He read a short portion of his declaration into the record, the part that mattered, and he read it the way he'd once swept that floor. Slowly, evenly, every word landing flat and clean in the silent room. He read the dates. He read what was said on the bay floor. The boy and the you people and the biological insult. Word for word. In the same level voice. So that for the first time those words existed somewhere. They could not be denied or explained away. He read the assault. The kicked broom. The shove into the shelf. The bucket of waste across a man's boots. In the flat factual language of a police report, he read the names of the men whose hours were cut in the weeks after they spoke up. Marcus. The week after he asked about the overtime. The geography of the routes. The rationed boots. The forms. He read the number. 4 grievances forwarded to county HR in 11 years. From a depot of 40 men. And he let that number sit in the silent courtroom, like a stone dropped in a still pond. The ripples reaching every corner of the room, and then he read the last line of his declaration. And it was the only moment his voice carried anything other than calm. The court further observes that the men of that depot kept careful records of their own mistreatment. In shoeboxes. On telephones. In the careful handwriting of men who can barely afford to be wrong. For years. Not because anyone with power ever asked to see them, but in the patient, fragile hope that someday, somehow, someone with the authority to read them finally would. He paused and looked up, and for one moment he was not a judge, but a porter's son. That day has come. He set down the page. The courtroom did not make a sound. He picked up his father's stopwatch off the bench, closed it gently in his fist, and recused himself from the case, stepping down, walking out through the door behind the bench, leaving behind a record that no institution on earth could now make disappear, and a courtroom full of people who would never forget the morning the janitor read the truth into the law. The case went to another judge, and because the record now existed, sworn, eyewitness, federal, corroborated by 200 shredded grievances and a county computer full of Dale Pruitt's own words. There was nowhere left for the machine to hide. Here is what came of it. Not vibes. Not exposed, but not ruined. Consequences with the full force of law behind them. Dale Pruitt was terminated by Calhoun County the week the federal vehicles appeared. That was the small part. The larger part, he was charged federally with conspiracy against civil rights and deprivation of rights under color of law. The same statutes Elias Boone had spent his career wielding against men exactly like him. The physical assaults, the kicked broom, the shove, the bucket, became counts of their own. The destruction of the grievances became an obstruction count. He took a plea rather than face a jury that would hear 40 men testify and watch a federal judge describe being shoved into a shelf. He served time. He will never again hold a position of public trust. Never again have a key to anyone's box. Never again stand over a smaller man and call him boy. His two favored supervisors, the ones who'd witnessed the assaults and laughed at the bay floor performances, were terminated as well. One cooperated and avoided charges. One did not, but the men understood. And Elias Boone had understood from the very first night in that supply closet that punishing Dale Pruitt was never the point. A fired Pruitt just means a new Pruitt with the same key. The point was the machine, so this is the part that actually mattered. The Department of Justice opened a full pattern or practice review of Calhoun County's public employment, and the county, staring down a federal civil rights case it could not possibly win. A case anchored by a sitting federal judge's sworn eyewitness account and 200 shredded grievances, did what counties do when the alternative is a jury. It signed a consent decree, a binding, court-enforced agreement to change. A consent decree is not an apology. An apology is words, and words evaporate. A consent decree is a federal court reaching into an institution and rewiring how it works, with the power to drag that institution back into a courtroom every time it slips. It is the difference between a man saying he's sorry and a man being made to change the locks, and this one did what no single firing ever could. The grievance box was abolished, not reformed. Abolished. In its place, a grievance system that bypassed every local supervisor entirely and went directly, electronically, with an automatic confirmation receipt to the worker's own phone, to an independent monitor appointed by the court. A man would now get a time-stamped receipt the instant he filed, proof in his own hand that his words existed. No supervisor would ever again hold the key to another man's voice. The shredder behind the superintendent's desk became, overnight, a useless machine. The overtime system was rebuilt, posted publicly on the bay wall, distributed by transparent rotation and seniority, audited every quarter by the monitor. The feudal grain was gone. No more lake routes as rewards and gravel runs as punishment. No more morning auditions for the privilege of being treated like a human being. A man's Saturday overtime now depended on a posted list anyone could check, not on how hard he'd laughed at the boss's joke. The safety gear became a right again instead of a reward. The county was ordered to supply it on a schedule the monitor enforced. And the practice of making men sign forms acknowledging temporarily unavailable equipment was banned outright. Hector got his respirator. So did every man on the salt. Every attitude file the county was found to be keeping was ordered destroyed. And the keeping of secret, off the books, disciplinary files was banned, with penalties. The 8 pages on Marcus, the 3 years on Roy, all of it gone, with a federal order behind the deletion and an independent monitor, selected by the court, paid for by the county, would oversee the depot's employment practices for 5 years, with the power to investigate, the power to interview any worker, the power to report directly to a federal judge, and the power to haul the county back into court the moment it backslid. For 5 years, the men of the Calhoun County Public Works Depot would work inside a system that had to answer, in writing, to a federal court. Most of them had never in their lives worked inside a system that had to answer to anyone, and every man who had been wrongfully fired or wrongfully denied hours was made whole, reinstated. Back pay. Their records cleared. Marcus Tillman got his job back, with 3 weeks of back pay, and a letter in his file that said his termination had been unlawful, the same file Pruitt had tried to bury him with. The day he came back to the depot, he walked in through the same bay where he'd once stood in the doorway, holding a box of his belongings, hating a man with a purity that scared him. This time, the box was empty, and he was carrying it the other direction. Back to his locker, Roy Delgado clapped him on the shoulder. Curtis shook his hand, and the new grievance terminal hummed on the wall by the break room. And Marcus stopped and looked at it for a second. This little machine that gave a man a receipt for his own voice. And thought about a quiet old janitor on a tailgate, saying your wife is the smartest person at this depot. And he had to clear his throat and keep walking. His wife, the smartest person in their household, framed the photograph of the grievance she'd told him to keep. It hangs in their kitchen, over the table where their kids do their homework. When they're old enough to ask about it, Marcus is going to tell them the whole thing. The box, the shredder, the cars on the gravel, the day they found out who Eli really was, and what their mother's stubbornness was worth. Keep a record of everything. It was worth a career. It was worth a record that reached the one man on earth who could read it. Roy Delgado got the safety gear, the cleared write-ups, and, most of all, the 3 years he needed to reach the pension he'd been promised. He retired the next spring, with his back brace and his dignity, both finally supplied. On his last day, the crew put a folding table out in the bay, and somebody's wife brought a sheet cake. And Roy gave a short speech that was mostly him getting choked up and waving his hand and saying, all right, that's enough. But at the end of it, he held up his shoebox, the same one he'd carried into the break room, and sat down with both hands in front of a federal agent, and he said, I kept this for 3 years thinking nobody would ever look. Turns out you just gotta hold on long enough for the right person to walk in. And he set the box down, and 40 men clapped. And somewhere in that bay, you could almost feel the ghost of a quiet janitor nodding. Dale Pruitt didn't get a redemption arc. This story doesn't need one. And pretending he transformed would be a lie. And Elias Boone had no use for lies. What Pruitt got was accountability. The precise, documented, enforceable kind that he had spent 11 years making sure none of his men could ever reach. He'd built his whole little kingdom on the certainty that the people at the bottom had no record, no channel, and no one with power who would ever bother to look. And it turned out the most disposable man in his building, the one he'd kicked and shoved and told to sweep faster, had been building the record the entire time. And Elias Boone, he did not get revenge. And if you'd offered it to him, he'd have declined. He got something his father, the Pullman porter, who was timed for 40 years, never lived to see. He got to be the man who was already inside the room when the institution finally looked up. He kept his promise to Adair. He didn't go quiet. He didn't get small. A local reporter got the thread of it. A fired janitor who turned out to be a federal judge. A consent decree. A shredded grievance box. And the story moved beyond the valley. It ran under a headline that wasn't quite right, but caught something true. The judge who swept the floor. People asked Judge Boone, in the few interviews he gave, the obvious question: why would a confirmed federal judge spend 9 months pushing a broom and let a man treat him like that? He answered it the same way every time. And it was never quite the answer they expected. For 30 years, I judged how institutions treat people from the outside and from above. He said, I wanted once, before I spent the rest of my life ruling on these cases, to feel it from the inside and from the bottom, to wear the uniform of the most overlooked man in the building, and find out what a public institution does to a person when it is certain no one important is watching. He paused. I found out, and then I had the means to do something about it. Most men at the bottom of that depot had been telling the truth for years. The only thing they were missing was someone with the power to listen who'd actually stood where they stood. I decided to stand there. He went back to the bench. He hears cases now. Many of them, inevitably, against counties and agencies and departments, brought by people the system decided not to see. The lawyers who appear before him have learned something. This is a judge who has stood on the floor those cases are about. You cannot tell him it's complicated when a man's hours get cut the week he speaks up. He has swept that floor. He has had the broom kicked out of his hands. The men of the depot still work there. The trucks still run. But the grievance system works now. And the overtime is fair. And there is a federal monitor who answers to a judge. And every so often, when a new seasonal hire complains that the old-timers are hard to read, one of them will tell the story. The day the federal cars came down the gravel, the day they found out who Eli really was, and end it the same way. Be decent to the quiet ones. You have no idea who's holding that broom. And on the wall by the break room, a new hire will sometimes stop in front of the grievance terminal. The little machine that prints a receipt the instant you file. Proof in your own hand that your voice exists and was received and cannot be made to vanish. And an old-timer will tell him what used to stand there instead. A locked box. One man's key. A shredder behind a desk that ate 200 men's careful handwriting over 11 years. The new hire usually doesn't quite understand how much that little humming terminal is worth. And the old-timer lets it go. Because some things you only understand after you've spent years building a record nobody asked to see. Holding on to a shoebox. Hoping the right person walks in. One day, on Depot Road, the right person did, and somewhere in the federal courthouse downtown, in chambers, on a shelf where a judge keeps the few objects that mean anything, sits a brass stopwatch, 40 years old, worn smooth, the one a conductor used to time a Pullman porter named Cornelius Boone, who came home every night with his dignity folded small and set it on the table where his son could see it. His son sets it on the bench now. Sometimes, during the cases that matter most, where the light catches it, where he can see it, it still ticks. So what did you just hear? A story about a janitor who got kicked and shoved by his boss? That's the simple version, but here's what it was really about. It was about a world that decides who you are before you say a word, that looks at a gray coverall and a broom and a black man's face and concludes, instantly, with total confidence, that there is nothing underneath worth respecting, nothing that can't be shoved into a shelf and splashed with a bucket of waste. Dale Pruitt didn't assault a federal judge by accident. He assaulted whoever was holding that broom, because the broom told him everything he thought he needed to know. The man underneath was irrelevant. That's the disease, not the cruelty in any one moment. The certainty, the absolute confidence that the person at the bottom is no one, and will always be no one, and can be timed and shoved and spat on and shredded without consequence. Elias Boone wasn't invisible because he lacked standing. He had more standing than every person in that depot combined. He was invisible because the people who run things have been trained their whole lives not to look, to read the uniform and skip the man. And here is the harder truth, the one the story is really built on. There are men like the ones in that depot in every county in this country, people telling the truth for years, keeping their grievances in shoeboxes and on their phones, building careful records of their own mistreatment in the patient. Fragile hope that someday, someone with the power to do something will finally bother to read them. Most of the time, no one comes. Most of the time, there is no judge with a broom. The grievance goes in the box, and the box goes in the shredder, and the man goes home and tells his wife it's fine. It's getting better. When it isn't getting better, because what else is he going to say? The question this story asks wasn't it satisfying when the judge walked in? The question is, how many depots are there with no judge in them? How many Marcus Tillmans are photographing grievances right now that no one with power will ever read? How many Roy Delgados are 3 years short of a pension? Asking for a back brace. Getting a write-up instead. Justice isn't a single moment when the robe walks in. That's the fantasy. The reality is the patient, unglamorous work of building a record. And building a system that has to answer to that record. A grievance line that bypasses the man with the key. A monitor who reports to a court. An overtime board posted on the wall where everyone can see it. The judge was the spark. The consent decree was the change. Don't confuse the two. And don't ever again let a uniform tell you who a man is. If this story made you feel something, anger, or hope, or both, then it did what it was meant to do. But a feeling only matters if it moves. So, here's what I'll ask you. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one in the coverall, the one holding the broom, the one whose grievance went in a box you didn't trust, tell me in the comments. Tell me about the time someone decided who you were before you opened your mouth and turned out to be dead wrong. And if you've ever been the one with the clipboard, the one with a little authority and a person in front of you that you've decided is no one. Remember Dale Pruitt straightening his tie, looking up at the bench, and watching the floor of the world drop out from under him. Remember that you never, ever know who's holding the broom. If you want more stories like this, about the people the world decided not to see, and the day it finally had to, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week, we find another one. Next time, quote, a hospital tells a janitor to mop up a code that's coding and then reads the name on his old hospital badge. You won't want to miss it. One last image before you go. A federal courtroom. A hard case. A county. A fired worker. The kind of case that turns on whether anyone in power is willing to actually look. The judge listens. He doesn't rush. And on the bench in front of him, where the gallery can't quite see it but he can, sits a small brass stopwatch, worn smooth by 40 years of a conductor's thumb. They can time your hands. They can time every step you take in this life, but they cannot time your worth. Be decent to the quiet ones. You have no idea who's holding the broom.